When two people are locked in the anxious-avoidant dynamic, it can look from the outside like confusion, like immaturity, like two people who simply cannot get it right. But if you look deeper, something more human is happening, something more painful. They are not just choosing each other repeatedly, they are being pulled back by systems inside themselves that were formed long before they ever met. One person learns early that love must be earned through pursuit, through proving, through staying available even when it hurts. So they chase closeness the way someone chases air underwater. The other learns that closeness can feel like pressure, expectation, or loss of self. So they step back the moment things feel emotionally intense, not because they don't care, but because their nervous system reads closeness as danger. And here's where it becomes complicated. Each person becomes exactly what the other person's deepest wound is built to react to. One runs, the other chases. One distances, the other pursues harder. And in that movement, something powerful gets mistaken for love, because intensity feels like meaning. The silence after a withdrawal feels like loss. The return feels like relief. And the cycle begins to wire itself into the body like truth. What makes it even harder to break apart is that neither person is getting only pain. There are moments, real moments of connection, moments where the avoidant partner opens slightly, where the anxious partner feels chosen, and those moments become emotional anchors. They become proof that this could work. But those moments are not the pattern, they are the interruption of the pattern. And the human mind is very bad at letting go of potential. Not reality, potential. So instead of seeing the full truth, this connection is costing me peace. Both partners begin negotiating with hope. If I change a little, if I wait a little longer, if I love a little better, maybe this time it will stabilize. But here is the deeper truth most people don't want to face. Stability is not created through effort alone. It is created when two nervous systems feel safe enough to stop defending themselves. And in these dynamics, safety is constantly being disrupted. One person feels smothered and retreats. The other feels abandoned and intensifies. And both leave the interaction more activated than before. So why is it so hard to split up? Because separation doesn't just mean losing the relationship. It means losing the emotional cycle that has become familiar. Even if it hurts, even if it drains, even if it confuses, familiar pain is still familiarity. And the nervous system will often choose what it knows over what is healthy. There is also something deeper happening. Identity fusion. The anxious partner often builds identity around the one who cares more. The avoidant partner builds identity around the one who needs space. Leaving the relationship feels like losing not just a person but a role they have, unconsciously played for a long time. And that's why distance feels unbearable. Not because love is so strong, but because withdrawal from the pattern feels like withdrawal from something chemically and emotionally embedded. But here is the truth that eventually becomes unavoidable. Anything that keeps you in a loop of anxiety is not love in its highest form. It is attachment without safety. It is connection without steadiness. It is chemistry without peace. Real love does not make you question your worth every time there is silence. Real love does not require you to abandon yourself to keep someone close. And real love does not feel like you are constantly trying to earn back emotional air. The moment you begin to see the pattern clearly, something powerful happens. You stop negotiating with potential and start respecting your nervous system's truth. You realize that missing someone is not always a sign you should return it, is sometimes a sign you are detoxing from emotional intensity, that you are mistaken for intimacy. And in that clarity, something shifts. You stop asking, how do I make this work? And start asking, why did I accept so little peace for so long? Because the real transformation is not learning how to hold on better. It is learning when love is asking you to let go, not out of anger, not out of fear, but out of self-respect strong enough to break a cycle that never gave you room to breathe. And when that moment comes, it doesn't feel like loss anymore. It feels like finally coming back to yourself. When you look at the dynamic between an avoidant and an anxious partner, what you often assume at first glance is that it's about personality differences, communication styles, or even compatibility. But underneath all of that surface explanation, something far more primal is happening. This is not just two people misunderstanding each other, it is two nervous systems speaking in completely different survival languages, each interpreting the same moment through a different internal alarm system. The anxious partner tends to experience connection as safety, so when distance appears, even in small forms like delayed replies, emotional withdrawal, or subtle shifts in tone, their internal system doesn't read it as neutral. It reads it as threat. Not a logical threat, but an emotional and physiological one. The body begins to respond before the mind can catch up. Heart rate increases, thoughts become urgent, attention narrows. Suddenly the focus is not on the broader reality of the relationship, but on restoring proximity. The anxious system says, something is wrong. Fix it. Move closer. Don't lose this. On the other side, the avoidant partner often experiences closeness differently. Where the anxious system moves toward connection under stress, the avoidant system often moves away. Not because they don't feel, but because their body interprets intensity, expectation, or emotional demand as pressure. And pressure for them creates an internal need for space, distance, and autonomy in order to regulate. So when things become emotionally charged, instead of leaning in, they instinctively step back to regain equilibrium. What creates the push-pull dynamic is not just these two reactions existing independently, but how perfectly they trigger each other. The more the avoidant pulls away to find calm, the more the anxious partner feels uncertainty and moves closer to restore security. And the more the anxious partner moves closer, the more the avoidant feels overwhelmed and pulls away again. Neither person is trying to hurt the other. Both are trying to regulate themselves. But the problem is that their regulation strategies are opposite. Over time, this creates a loop that feels incredibly emotionally charged. And here is where things get confusing for both people involved. The nervous system does not always distinguish between intensity and intimacy. When someone feels anxious, then relieved when the other returns, that relief is powerful. It can feel like love. When someone withdraws, then reconnects, that reconnection can feel like proof that the bond is strong. So instead of recognizing the instability as a warning sign, both partners begin to associate the emotional spikes with meaning. The anxious partner may think, I feel this strongly, so it must mean this connection is deep. The avoidant partner may think, I need space, but I still come back, so this must be important. But what is actually happening is a cycle of activation and relief, not steady emotional safety. This cycle becomes especially powerful because it reinforces itself through repetition. Each time the avoidant distances and then returns, the anxious partner experiences a wave of distress followed by emotional relief. That relief is chemically reinforcing. Each time the anxious partner pursues and the avoidant responds, even briefly, the avoidant gets a sense of reconnection without sustained pressure, which feels tolerable. So both nervous systems are being trained, not in calm connection, but in emotional volatility, followed by temporary repair. And this is why it becomes so hard to break. Because even though the pattern is painful, it is also familiar. The body begins to expect it. It begins to anticipate the cycle. And what the mind interprets as confusion, the nervous system interprets as normality. So the deeper truth is that this dynamic is not just about two people struggling to understand each other. It is about two people repeatedly activating each other's earliest attachment responses, over and over again, until the relationship starts to feel like a loop of longing, relief, fear, and hope. And in that loop, both people slowly lose sight of what calm connection actually feels like, because calm never gets enough repetition to become the baseline. At the core of this dynamic sits a kind of emotional polarity that feels almost designed to collide. The anxious partner and the avoidant partner are not just reacting differently to relationships, they are often responding from two completely different internal definitions of what love even means. For one, love means closeness, availability, responsiveness, and emotional presence. For the other, love means freedom, space, autonomy, and the absence of pressure. Neither definition is wrong on its own, but when they meet in the same relationship, they can start to feel like contradictions that constantly destabilize each other. The anxious partner carries a deep fear of abandonment, but it is not just the fear of someone physically leaving. It is the fear of emotional disappearance, the fear that someone will become less available, less interested, less emotionally reachable. Because of this, the anxious system becomes highly attuned to changes in connection. A delayed reply is not just a delayed reply, it can feel like disconnection. A shift in tone is not just a shift in tone, it can feel like withdrawal of love. The anxious mind begins scanning for signs of distance, the way someone might scan the horizon for danger. It is not choice, it is conditioning. Somewhere along the line, love became associated with uncertainty. So uncertainty now feels like threat. So when closeness is threatened, the anxious partner doesn't simply feel disappointed. They feel activated. They feel urgency. Their instinct is to repair, to reach out, to restore connection as quickly as possible. Because in their internal world, closeness equals safety. If the connection weakens, safety feels like it is slipping away. On the other side, the avoidant partner is not disconnected from emotion, but their relationship with closeness is filtered through a different kind of alarm system. For them, too much emotional intensity can feel overwhelming. Too many expectations, too much closeness, too fast, too much emotional demand can trigger a sense of losing themselves. So instead of moving toward connection when stress rises, they move away from it. Not to reject love, but to regulate their internal state. Where the anxious partner moves toward, the avoidant partner moves away. And this is where the misunderstanding begins to deepen, because each person interprets the other's survival response through their own emotional framework. The anxious partner sees distance and assumes disinterest, rejection, or loss of love. The avoidant partner sees pursuit and assumes pressure, expectation, or emotional suffocation. Both are reacting to threat as they perceive it, but neither threat is actually the same thing. This creates a painful irony. The anxious partner's fear of abandonment leads them to pursue connection more intensely. But that pursuit can make the avoidant partner feel more overwhelmed. And the avoidant partner's need for space leads them to withdraw. But that withdrawal intensifies the anxious partner's fear. So each person's coping strategy unintentionally activates the other person's wound. The anxious partner thinks, if I can just get closer, I'll feel safe. The avoidant partner thinks, if I can just get a little space, I'll feel safe. But the tragedy is that both strategies are happening in the same relationship at the same time, pulling in opposite directions. And over time, something very powerful starts to form. Emotional dependence on the cycle itself. The anxious partner becomes accustomed to the pattern of distance, followed by reconnection, and the relief that comes after reconnection can feel like emotional oxygen. The avoidant partner becomes accustomed to closeness, followed by withdrawal, and the relief of space can feel like emotional reset. So even though both are struggling, both are also being repeatedly soothed by the return to their individual comfort states. This is why it becomes so difficult to break apart, because the relationship is not experienced as constant panic, is experienced as fluctuation between distress and relief, and the nervous system is extremely sensitive to relief. It remembers it. It starts to expect it. It starts to chase it. So what looks from the outside like incompatibility is, from the inside, a deeply entrenched rhythm of activation and calming that both partners have become emotionally familiar with. The anxious partner fears losing connection. The avoidant partner fears losing themselves. And in trying to protect themselves from those fears, they unknowingly build a loop where both fears are continuously triggered by the other person's natural response. And in that loop, the relationship stops feeling like a stable place of love and starts feeling like a cycle of emotional survival that neither person fully understands how to exit, even when part of them knows they are exhausted. What makes this dynamic so powerful is not just the emotional mismatch between two people, but the way the nervous system begins to confuse instability with connection. In a healthy relationship, emotional safety creates consistency. You know where you stand. You don't have to decode silence or interpret distance. But in an anxious avoidant bond, consistency is often missing. And instead what appears is a rhythm of uncertainty followed by relief. And over time, that rhythm starts to rewire perception itself. The anxious partner, living with heightened sensitivity to emotional shifts, experiences separation or withdrawal as distress. That distress builds urgency. The mind starts searching, analyzing, replaying conversations, trying to find certainty where there is ambiguity. When reconnection finally happens, even in small ways, there is a powerful release of tension. That release doesn't just feel good, it feels essential. It feels like coming back to air after holding your breath. And the mind, in its simplicity, starts to link the person with the relief, not just the pain. The avoidant partner is also caught in a similar but opposite loop. When emotional closeness increases, they may feel pressure, expectation, or a sense of being emotionally consumed. That creates internal discomfort. So they withdraw, creating distance that immediately reduces that pressure. When they return and things feel lighter again, they experience relief in the opposite direction. So both partners are learning, at a subconscious level, that distance and return are regulating emotional states. This is where the addiction-like bonding begins to form. Not addiction in the simplistic sense, but in the nervous system sense of intermittent reinforcement. Psychologically, intermittent reinforcement is one of the most powerful conditioning patterns for attachment. It means that rewards are unpredictable, and unpredictability is exactly what makes the brain latch on more intensely. When something is inconsistent, the mind works harder to obtain it. It invests more attention, more emotional energy, more hope. In this dynamic, the reward is reconnection, attention, affection, emotional availability, but it is not consistent. It comes after withdrawal, silence, distance, or conflict. So the brain starts to associate emotional highs with emotional lows. The relief after anxiety becomes more memorable than the anxiety itself. The warmth after distance becomes more emotionally significant than the stability that is missing. This is why people in this pattern often describe the relationship as "I know it's not good for me, but I can't let go." That sentence is not about logic. It is about conditioning. The body has been trained to respond to the cycle, not just the person. There is also another layer that deepens the attachment: emotional contrast. In stable relationships, emotional tone is relatively even. In this dynamic, contrast is extreme. Distance feels very distant. Reconnection feels very intimate. Silence feels very cold. Engagement feels very warm. That contrast amplifies emotional memory. The highs feel higher because they follow lows, and the lows feel deeper because they interrupt highs. So the relationship begins to feel more intense than it actually is in terms of consistent emotional depth. And intensity is often mistaken for meaning. The mind equates strong emotional activation with significance. It assumes if it affects me this much, it must be important. But emotional activation is not the same as emotional health. A system that constantly moves between stress and relief will feel more powerful than a system that remains steady, even if the steady system is healthier. The danger is that both partners start becoming dependent, not on each other's presence, but on the cycle itself. The anxious partner becomes attached to the possibility of reconnection. The avoidant partner becomes attached to the relief of withdrawal. So even when both are unhappy in the pattern, both are also familiar with what comes next. And familiarity creates a strange sense of comfort, even in pain. This is also why external advice often doesn't land. From the outside, it looks simple. Just leave, just communicate better, just slow down. But internally, the nervous system is not responding to logic. It is responding to learned emotional rhythms. And anything that interrupts that rhythm can feel destabilizing, even if it is healthier. So what keeps the cycle alive is not just love, or compatibility, or misunderstanding. It is conditioning through emotional unpredictability, a loop where distress and relief become intertwined, where connection and separation become part of the same emotional script, and where the mind starts to confuse the intensity of the cycle with the depth of the bond. One of the most misunderstood parts of this dynamic is how easily emotional intensity gets mistaken for emotional depth. When two people are caught in the anxious avoidance cycle, what they often experience is not steady connection, but fluctuation. Highs feel very high, lows feel very low, and because the nervous system is being repeatedly activated, everything feels amplified. This amplification creates the illusion of something profound, something fated, something deeply significant. But intensity is not the same as intimacy, even though the two often get confused in emotionally charged relationships. Intimacy is built in consistency. It is built in predictability, emotional availability, and the ability to stay connected even when things are not exciting or dramatic. Intimacy is what remains when there is no uncertainty to chase and no distance to repair. But in an anxious avoidant dynamic, calm is often rare. Instead, the relationship moves between pursuit and withdrawal, closeness and distance, connection and disconnection. And that movement creates emotional spikes that feel meaningful in the moment. When the anxious partner finally gets reassurance after a period of distance, the emotional relief can feel overwhelming. It is not just comfort, it is a release of internal tension that has been building. That release can feel like love returning. But what is actually being experienced is the ending of distress, not the presence of stable connection. The brain is so relieved to no longer be in uncertainty that it overvalues the moment of reconnection. It assigns it emotional weight that may not reflect the actual quality of the bond. For the avoidant partner, the experience is also intensified, but in a different direction. After feeling emotionally overwhelmed or pressured, distance brings relief. That relief can feel like clarity, like peace, like this is better. Then, when reconnection happens again, there can be a surge of warmth or nostalgia that feels like missing the person deeply. So both partners are experiencing emotional highs, but those highs are often tied to the resolution of internal stress rather than the presence of secure connection. This is where confusion begins, because when emotions are strong, the mind assumes the relationship must be important. We are conditioned to believe that depth is measured by how much something makes us feel. But emotional intensity is often just a reflection of activation in the nervous system. It is the body responding to perceived threat, relief, loss, and return. It is not necessarily a reflection of how safe, stable, or aligned the connection actually is. In this cycle, the relationship becomes a source of emotional activation rather than emotional grounding. There is rarely neutrality. Even silence becomes charged. Even small changes in communication become significant. The nervous system is always on alert, always interpreting, always responding. And in that heightened state, even ordinary moments can feel loaded with meaning. Another reason intensity gets mistaken for intimacy is because of contrast. When emotional states swing between extremes, the contrast makes everything feel larger. A small moment of affection after distance can feel incredibly powerful. A brief moment of connection after conflict can feel deeply meaningful. But the power of that moment is often proportional to the preceding discomfort, not to the actual depth of the connection itself. Over time, this contrast creates emotional memory distortion. The mind remembers the highs more vividly than the steady gaps in between. It remembers the rush of reconnection, the intensity of missing someone, the emotional charge of uncertainty. It does not always equally weigh the long stretches of instability or confusion. So the relationship becomes mentally represented as so deep, so intense, so meaningful, even if the actual lived experience is inconsistent and often distressing. There is also a psychological reason why intensity feels like depth. The human brain equates effort with value. When something requires emotional effort, waiting, chasing, repairing, questioning it feels like it must matter more. Ease, on the other hand, can be misinterpreted as lack of significance. So a calm connection can feel boring, while a turbulent one feels real. But what is often being felt as real is simply activation. In truth, emotional depth is not measured by how much a relationship disturbs your peace. It is measured by how safe you feel to be fully yourself without needing to earn consistency or decode affection. But in this dynamic, that baseline safety is rarely present long enough to be recognized. Instead, the nervous system becomes accustomed to highs and lows, and those fluctuations begin to define what love is supposed to feel like. So the real challenge is not just experiencing intensity, but recognizing that intensity can be misleading. It can mimic significance while masking instability. And when that happens, people don't just fall in love with each other, they fall in love with the emotional weather system between them. Mistaking storms for depth and calm moments of return for proof of connection. At a biological level, what keeps this dynamic so sticky is not just emotion or psychology, it is learning. The nervous system is constantly adapting to patterns, especially patterns that involve strong emotional activation. When two people repeatedly trigger each other's attachment systems, the brain does not sit back as a neutral observer. It records, it predicts, and it begins to automate responses. Over time, the relationship stops being something you consciously participate in and starts becoming something your body anticipates. In the anxious avoidance cycle, the nervous system is exposed to repeated waves of activation and relief. The anxious partner experiences activation when there is distance, uncertainty, or emotional withdrawal. The avoidant partner experiences activation when there is perceived pressure, expectation, or emotional closeness that feels overwhelming. Then both experience relief when the system shifts again, when distance restores calm for one, and reconnection restores safety for the other. This repeated sequence is important because the nervous system does not just respond to events, it responds to patterns of events. And when a pattern repeats often enough, it becomes encoded as expectation. The brain begins to anticipate the cycle before it happens. It starts preparing for withdrawal, for pursuit, for reconnection, for emotional swings. This anticipation itself becomes part of the experience, which means the relationship is no longer just about what is happening now, but about what is expected to happen next. This is where chemical reinforcement plays a role. Emotional highs and lows are not abstract, they are tied to neurochemical changes. Stress responses activate systems in the body that increase alertness, urgency, and emotional focus. Relief responses activate systems that create calm, release tension, and sometimes even emotional euphoria. When these states alternate, the brain starts associating the partner not just with comfort or discomfort, but with the entire cycle of activation and relief. One of the most powerful mechanisms here is unpredictability. When affection, attention, or emotional availability is inconsistent, the brain becomes more engaged. It pays more attention. It monitors more closely. It becomes hyper-aware of signals. This is not a conscious decision, it is a survival-based learning mechanism. The nervous system is essentially trying to predict safety. And when safety is unpredictable, attention increases. So instead of the relationship feeling stable and calm, it becomes mentally central. Thoughts about the partner become frequent. Emotional monitoring increases. The mind starts scanning for cues. Are they distant today? Are they warm today? What does this silence mean? What does this message mean? This heightened monitoring reinforces attachment because attention is being repeatedly directed toward the relationship. At the same time, the avoidant partner is also being conditioned, but in the opposite direction. When emotional intensity rises, their system learns to associate closeness with overload. So withdrawal becomes a learned regulation strategy. The more they withdraw and feel relief, the more their nervous system reinforces the idea that space equals safety. Then, when they return and the emotional intensity is manageable again, they also experience a form of relief, which reinforces reconnection, but only up to a certain threshold. Beyond that threshold, the cycle repeats. This is why both partners often feel pulled back into the relationship, even when they consciously know it is unstable. The pull is not purely emotional longing, it is conditioned nervous system response. The body recognizes familiar emotional states and moves toward them, even if the mind is conflicted. Familiarity, even when painful, creates a sense of predictability, and predictability is deeply regulating for the nervous system. Over time, this creates a kind of emotional dependency loop. Not necessarily dependency on the person as they are, but dependency on the cycle of activation and resolution. The anxious partner becomes accustomed to the emotional surge that comes after reconnection. The avoidant partner becomes accustomed to the emotional release that comes after withdrawal. Both begin to regulate their internal states through the relationship pattern itself. This is also why separation or distance from the relationship can feel unusually intense, even when logically it seems like the right decision. The nervous system is not just missing the person, it is missing the pattern it has adapted to. It is missing the predictable unpredictability. It is missing the familiar rhythm of activation and relief that it has learned to navigate. And when that pattern is removed, the body goes through a form of withdrawal. Thoughts intensify. Urges to reconnect appear. Emotional restlessness increases. Not because the relationship is necessarily healthy or stable, but because the nervous system has been trained through repetition to expect regulation through that bond. So what keeps the cycle alive is not simply attachment in the romantic sense. It is neuroplastic learning shaped by repeated emotional experiences. The nervous system has been taught, through consistency of inconsistency, that this relationship is a primary source of emotional regulation. And once that learning is in place, breaking away is not just a decision, it is a process of unlearning deeply embedded patterns of activation, anticipation, and relief. What makes separation in this dynamic so difficult is that it rarely feels like the loss of just a person. It feels much bigger than that, because over time the relationship stops being only about the partner in front of you and starts becoming a structure your emotional world organizes itself around. When that structure is threatened or removed, it can feel like parts of your identity are being pulled apart with it. For the anxious partner, the relationship often becomes a central reference point for emotional stability. Not because they consciously choose to depend on it, but because their nervous system has learned to orient around connection as a form of safety. So much of their internal experience becomes tied to the availability of the other person. When is there a message? When is there reassurance? When is there closeness? When is there distance? Over time, this creates an internal rhythm where emotional regulation is outsourced, in a sense, to the state of the relationship. So when separation is considered or happens, it is not experienced as simply I am losing a partner. It is experienced as I am losing my primary emotional regulator. That creates a deep internal disruption. Suddenly the signals that the nervous system has learned to track are gone. The familiar emotional highs and lows disappear, but the body still expects them. That mismatch creates discomfort, restlessness, and a sense of emotional disorientation. For the avoidant partner, identity fusion can look different, but is equally powerful. The relationship often becomes a space where they are constantly negotiating between closeness and self-preservation. Over time, they may build a strong internal identity around autonomy, independence, and emotional self-containment. Even within the relationship, they may unconsciously define themselves as the one who needs space or the one who cannot be overwhelmed. That role becomes part of how they understand themselves. So when separation enters the picture, it can feel like the removal of the relational environment, where that identity was constantly being activated and tested. There is a strange duality here. On one hand, they may feel relief at the idea of space. On the other hand, they may feel a loss of the relational mirror that defined how they understood their boundaries, their responses, and even their emotional limits. But beyond roles and identity structures, there is something even deeper happening. Familiarity. Humans do not just bond to people, they bond to emotional patterns. The anxious avoidance cycle, even though it is painful, becomes familiar. Through repetition, the nervous system learns its rhythms. The anticipation, the pursuit, the withdrawal, the return, the temporary relief. That sequence becomes predictable in its unpredictability. And familiarity creates a form of emotional grounding. Even chaos, when repeated, becomes known. So when separation occurs, what is often felt is not just sadness or longing, it is unfamiliar stillness. And that stillness can feel more unsettling than the emotional turbulence of the relationship itself. Because at least within the relationship, the emotional landscape was known. There were patterns to respond to, cues to interpret, cycles to navigate. When that is gone, the nervous system is left without its reference points. It doesn't know when the next emotional shift will come. It doesn't know what to anticipate. That lack of pattern can feel like emptiness, even if the relationship itself was not consistently fulfilling. And in that emptiness, the mind often reaches back not necessarily to the healthiest version of the relationship, but to the most emotionally charged moments, because those are the ones most strongly encoded. This is why memory becomes distorted during separation. The mind tends to highlight intensity over consistency. It remembers the moments of reconnection, the emotional highs, the powerful relief after distance. It does not equally weight the anxiety, confusion, or instability. So the relationship begins to feel like something deeply significant that is being lost, even if the lived reality was often destabilizing. There is also a deeper existential layer. Losing this kind of relationship can feel like losing a version of yourself that existed inside that emotional cycle. The version of you that chased, that waited, that hoped, that withdrew, that reconnected. Those emotional states were not just reactions to the other person, they became part of your lived identity. So separation can feel like stepping out of a role you didn't fully realize you were playing. And this is why letting go is rarely a clean emotional break. It is more like a gradual disentangling of identity, memory, expectation, and nervous system conditioning. The absence of the person is only one layer. Beneath that is the absence of familiarity, the absence of emotional rhythm, and the absence of a relational structure that, even in its instability, had become deeply embedded in how the inner world functioned. One of the most persistent forces that keeps this dynamic alive is hope, but not hope in a simple or conscious sense. It is not just "I want this to work." It is a deeper psychological investment in the idea that the pattern will eventually resolve itself if something changes just enough. That something can shift over time. It might be if I become more understanding, or if I communicate better, or if they feel safer with me, or if I give them more space. But underneath all of those variations is the same underlying belief. This is fixable if we just find the right adjustment. The problem is that this belief often ignores the fact that the cycle itself is the problem, not just the behavior inside it. But hope does not easily see systems, it focuses on moments. It focuses on the last good conversation, the last moment of closeness, the last time things felt aligned. Those moments become evidence. They become proof that the relationship has potential. And potential is one of the most powerful emotional anchors humans can have, especially when it is tied to attachment. In an anxious avoidant dynamic, hope is constantly reinforced because the relationship does not remain static. There are breaks in distance, returns after withdrawal, moments of emotional openness, followed by retreat. These shifts create what feels like progress, even when the overall pattern is unchanged. So instead of seeing repetition, the mind sees variation. Instead of seeing a loop, it sees a journey. And journeys feel like they are heading somewhere. The anxious partner often holds hope through emotional meaning making. They interpret moments of closeness as signs of what the relationship really is underneath the distance. So when the avoidant partner shows affection, vulnerability, or presence, then the relationship is at a crossroads. It is not seen as an isolated moment, it is seen as the real version of the relationship resurfacing. The distance that follows is then reinterpreted not as a pattern, but as a temporary block to overcome. The avoidant partner also holds hope, but in a different way. They may experience moments of closeness and think, maybe this time I can stay present longer. Or they may experience moments of distance and think, maybe if I manage space better, I can make this work without feeling overwhelmed. So they are also engaged in a form of internal negotiation, trying to find a version of the relationship that allows both connection and autonomy without triggering their system. What keeps both partners locked in is that neither of them is entirely wrong. There are genuine moments of connection. There are real feelings present. There are times when things feel aligned, and those moments are powerful enough to sustain belief that the relationship is not fundamentally broken, just not yet stable. But hope becomes problematic when it overrides pattern recognition, because patterns require emotional distance to see clearly. Inside the relationship, hope tends to highlight exceptions rather than the rule. It magnifies the best moments and minimizes the cost of the cycle. It says, yes, it's hard, but look how good it can be. And that can be becomes more emotionally influential than what consistently is. This is why people stay longer than they understand. It is not because they are unaware of pain. It is because they are also aware of the possibility. And possibility carries emotional weight because it represents a future version of reality where the current pain no longer exists. The mind becomes invested in that version sometimes, more than the present one. There is also a subtle psychological mechanism at play. Intermittent reinforcement feeds hope. Because the relationship does not fail completely, hope is never fully disproven. Instead, it is repeatedly reactivated. Each reconnection feels like evidence that change is happening. Each moment of closeness feels like confirmation that things are improving. Even if, structurally, the cycle remains unchanged. This creates a powerful loop where hope is constantly renewed before it has a chance to dissolve. And because hope is emotionally rewarding, it becomes self-sustaining. It provides meaning during difficulty. It provides direction during confusion. It provides emotional endurance during uncertainty. But over time, hope can shift from being a motivator for healthy effort into a mechanism for tolerating instability. Instead of asking, is this relationship actually becoming safer and more consistent? The question becomes, what if the next phase is the breakthrough? And that question keeps the system open, even when the evidence is repetitive. The hardest part is that hope feels aligned with love. It feels compassionate, patient, and loyal. Letting go can feel like giving up on something that still has emotional significance. But at a certain point, the most honest form of clarity is recognizing that hope without structural change becomes emotional waiting. And waiting, when it is disconnected from real change, keeps people emotionally invested in a pattern that continues to renew itself without actually transforming. Thank you for your time and presence. May clarity and peace stay with you long after these words. Goodbye for now, and may your journey ahead bring you healthier love, deeper self-respect, and lasting emotional calm.